السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أنا فخور وفرحان جدا بوجودي هنا كرئيس الوفد الإسرائيلي.
Just a very important event, and it's an honor to have you with us, baby. Thank you very much.
I thank you both for your wise leadership and for working with the United States and Israel to expand the circle of peace.
Prime Minister of the State of Israel, thank you for choosing peace.
This was the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab country in over a quarter of a century.
Welcome to the second portion of our conference on the Abraham Accords towards a new Middle East. Today's program includes an interview with Special Envoy Avi Berkowitz, an expert panel on the Trump vision and its consequences for the Middle East, followed by Dr. Yechiel Leiter's brief lecture on plans for a binational free trade zone in the Jordan Valley, and finally, an international panel on the prospects for economic cooperation as a new paradigm for coexistence in the region. To begin the program, I'm honored to conduct an interview with Mr. Avi Berkowitz, Assistant to the President of the United States and Special Representative for International Negotiations, who, among other achievements, was instrumental in negotiating the Abraham Accords. Okay, Avi Berkowitz, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it. As is well known, you were one of the main contributors to the success of the negotiations that led to the Abraham Accords. Maybe you could give us a little bit of background. How did the whole thing begin? And if you don't mind, how did you end up with this fantastic gig?
So thank you for having me, and it's good to meet and speak and talk about a very exciting journey. I actually came a sort of not circular, but unfamiliar trajectory. I met Jared Kushner at a Pesach program in Arizona in 2011. Playing basketball. So it wasn't, even at the buffet, it was actually on the basketball court. And I didn't know who he was at the time, but we got to talking and we won a few games together. And after that, he offered me to come work for him at Kushner Companies. And the rest has been a very, very exciting history. But so just as it relates to the Middle East team, I began working after being on the campaign. I joined the White House as Jared Kushner's assistant, and then ultimately took over for Jason Greenblatt when he left in the special representative role. And the president, who deserves the lion's share of the credit for this deal, and Jared Kushner as well, told the team in 2017 to put out a peace plan, one that would really resolve the conflict, not pretend to do so. And so the team at the time was Jared, Jason Greenblatt, Ambassador David Friedman, and myself. And, we tried to put forth a plan that was realistic, that actually took into account the realities on the ground, and had a chance of success. And in doing so, when we were actually going through the region, Jared would meet with foreign leaders, and their main sort of message to him was, this has gone on for too long. And it wasn't just in the UAE, it wasn't just in Bahrain, it was throughout the region. And they're tired of it, and they would like to see a realistic proposal. And if they did see one, they would be open to potentially normalizing relations with Israel. And I think that's a very important sentiment, because it's sort of hard to know if there's real animosity between parties when a conflict has gone on as long as it has. And I think in some such scenarios, there is real animosity, and that needs to be worked through. But a lot of people just want better lives and to get to know one another and to move past the conflict. And so by putting out the plan, what I think Jared was able to do was set up a scenario whereby the Palestinians were given a realistic opportunity. Unfortunately, since December of 2017, when the president announced that we were going to be recognizing Jerusalem as the capital and moving our embassy there, they decided to no longer engage with us. And I am the person who is responsible to engage with them. So I can tell you it's sort of a complicated situation, but ultimately that, inability or unwillingness to engage was seen by a lot of regional partners as an inappropriate way to handle discourse, right? If you disagree with someone, the best way to make that known is, in our opinion, is to engage, and a lot of our regional partners agreed. And so and I apologize for a very long answer, but by setting up this sort of groundwork, we were really able to, put out a plan, show the world that Israel is willing to make peace, and then actually show the world that Israel can make peace and did make peace with the UAE and then ultimately with Bahrain. And so it's a very exciting opportunity, and we're glad that it came when it did.
Let me ask you, thanks a lot for that. Let me ask you specifically about the Abraham Accords, with the UAE and Bahrain. What were the main hurdles, and when in the process did you actually start to think, this might actually work?
So I have somebody on my team. His name is Scott Leith, and every single day when he would come in, when we were doing the negotiations, we had sort of like a game where we would say, what percentage do you think are the chance that we're going to get this deal done? And this is during the month of July and August. And we rarely got higher than about 85%. And he's a very optimistic, and I'm a very optimistic person, but these deals are so complex and they have so many different components to them that it's hard to know with any real degree of certainty that you've accomplished something until I've said, until I was sitting in the Oval Office with the president and Jared and hearing the president talking to the leaders, going through the actual, celebration of it, that I really allow myself to believe that it would happen. And even then, I'll be honest with you, that to me wasn't when the deal was done. It was done on September 15th, I think, when it was actually signed at the White House. And because, these things can drag out and they can get lost. And just seeing the other day, yesterday, Israel's cabinet voting unanimously to move forward, and now the Knesset also is going to vote on Thursday, I know it's going to happen, but I'd like to see it actually happen before I'm willing to take a sigh of relief.
Right. By the time we, this is actually shown, we'll know the answer to that. My guess is it's going to be okay. I don't think you have to worry about that.
Okay, I'm glad.
Okay, so you can relax for now. But there must have been a lot of lessons here for there was so many failed efforts at Middle East peace and so many predictions of a new Middle East, going back to the 90s that blew up in our faces. What do you think was different? What did you guys do differently this time that made it work?
Yeah, so I don't know a lot of the people who have worked on these deals in the past, just sort of passing hellos in hallways and things of that variety. And so I always am hesitant to judge what they did and how we did it differently, because I don't know enough to be a relevant critic on their work. But what I do know is, specifically as it relates to our work, I would say Jared Kushner and the president. So the president, he wasn't necessarily involved in the day-to-day back and forth, but what we were negotiating with was the capital that he built, right? The relationships that he created with the leaders in the region by standing behind Israel with the Jerusalem move, with the Golan move, with leaving the Iran deal, right? Things of that variety, where the people of Israel, but mostly the leadership of Israel, was able to see that there was a partner, a real ally, somebody who stood behind his word. And then similar with the UAE, in addition to leaving the Iran deal, numerous other things that didn't become public, but ways that we had interacted with them to show them that we were good faith actors. And so using that relationship, right, that the president created, that was what made this, I think, possible. But then on the sort of negotiating the day-to-day level, which was led by Jared and then myself, I think it was honesty. I think it was a real sense that the person across the way was someone that you could really trust. And even if Israel and the UAE didn't know each other, a lot of people have said, well, there's these under the table discussions. I'll tell you from my personal experience, that was not the case. It was really the US led the mediation efforts under Jared Kushner's leadership. And the sides, they knew each other, but they didn't have that degree of comfort with one another that I think is very important when making a deal. And so I really believe that it was the trust that they had in Jared and myself, and the fact that I like to believe that we're very honest people. I think that was ultimately the main sticking point in how this deal was actually able to get done.
Got it. Okay, so let me ask you about the relationship between the Abraham Accords and the Trump vision. They're not the same thing. One is a vision, the other is an actual accord. Do you see the Accords as part and parcel of that vision, as somehow completing it? Or is there a little bit of tension between them? And if I might challenge you just a wee bit,
Please.
One of the advances that many people in Israel saw in the vision was the extension of Israeli law to certain parts of Judea and Samaria, which is now suspended. We're not exactly sure what the word suspended means. So, how do you see that playing out? Do you think that part of the Trump vision is kind of off the table for now, or was that actually leverage in order to get the Accords? I mean, how do you see, where's the connection?
So as part of, I think, the honesty component, I think it's important to keep the timeline here. It's very important. When the plan was put out, it was put out because the administration has a fundamental belief on the best realistic way to resolve this conflict. And the vision for peace is the administration's position and remains the administration's position. So the notion of, applying Israeli law to areas of the West Bank, it's not something that we fundamentally disagree with. In fact, it's not something that we fundamentally would support. But after doing that, after putting out that vision, what became apparent was that in order to capitalize on this momentous, I think, historic opportunity, it was necessary to suspend a component of the vision for peace. Now, that's not to say that in the foreseeable future, it could not come back. And that's not to say that we fundamentally disagree with what our position was initially. In fact, we still stand behind that position, and it's very important to us. And I think everybody should understand that. But understanding that certain opportunities arise when they do, and taking advantage to capitalize on them, i.e. the Abraham Accords, is also, was paramount in this case. So that's sort of a complicated way of saying the vision for peace is the Trump administration's plan. It is something that we will always stand behind. And it's my sincere hope that we have the opportunity to stand behind it for the next 4 years and work towards its implementation. However, for the time being, the application of Israeli law has been suspended so that we can focus on capitalizing on the normalization and peace agreements.
Well, it would be great if, as you say, you've got another 4 years to see the vision through. But let me ask you, nevertheless, what do you think is the danger of a different administration that might have different views towards Israel and Iran and the Middle East in general, in terms of how the vision would play out, in terms of, the success of the Abraham Accords going forward?
Yeah, so it's something that I think everybody in my position would have to contend with, the possibility that someone else would come in and have a different foreign policy agenda or thought process. I was appreciative when the Biden camp put out a positive statement in support of the Abraham Accords, because it actually showed that this is something that has bipartisan support in the United States, which is a necessary, or at least helps ensure that the Abraham Accords will have a future that, it extends beyond however long our time in government is. And that's extraordinarily important. And, whether I'm in government or not, it would always be my pleasure and honor to help with whomever is working to advance that goal, because it's something that is not administration specific in my mind. It's something that is just good. And so things that are good should be pursued, ideally. And it's something that I hope to always be proud of, that it continues, and I hope more countries come aboard, whether we're here or not. I don't feel a sense of ownership that it has to be us that are the ones that make peace. As long as more peace is happening, that would be a great thing. As it relates to the vision for peace, the criticism is at least helpful because it shows you where other administrations would potentially lean. And specifically the Iran deal, the other side has criticized us for leaving it. And so it's at least reasonable to deduce that it's something that they consider to have been a success, despite what we consider to be a large amount of evidence to point in the opposite direction. And so I am nervous, if I'm just being completely honest, that a different administration would continue to pursue sort of appeasement type strategy with Iran, and whether its intention is so or not, it's hard to imagine that would not have negative ramifications on the normalization efforts, because even if it could sort of behind the scenes cause Israel and its regional partners to feel more aligned, the United States is the United States, and having a strong United States with, I think, the moral clarity in the region to push forward what is in the best interests of the US, but also in the best interests of Israel, does create opportunities like the one that we were able to seize upon thanks to the president and Jared of the Abraham Accords. And I think if you are in a world where the US is isolating its partners and allies in the Middle East, it becomes a lot more difficult to capitalize in the ways that we were able to. And so that's just a significant fear of mine that I hope will never be realized, because I think it could not be more important that President Trump be the one in charge of these things.
Okay, well, we've got an agreement with the with the Emirates and with Bahrain. Which countries might be next?
That is the question I get asked most. If I were someone who went to dinner parties, I think that would be the type of thing that I would be hit with the most. But I've luckily been able to avoid meeting too many people. We're in negotiations with a few other countries right now. Time is obviously a relevant component, these deals. And the beauty of the UAE deal, what was so instrumental about it, I think, coming to fruition, was the fact that nobody knew about it outside of a very select group of people that worked for Jared and then on the Israel and the UAE side as well. And the surprise factor wasn't just because it allowed us to frame what the actual deal was in reality, because sometimes what happens is if somebody doesn't like a component of something, so they'll just leak out that, which will make it seem like the deal is worse than it actually is. So in addition to that component, it also allowed the parties to speak freely amongst each other. And if you were to ask us at a specific snapshot, it's sort of like the story I mentioned earlier with Scott. We were at 65%. You might think that things were going in a bad way when really that's just how deals go. They take time and they're up and down and they're complicated. And so I've obviously seen the news stories about Sudan and Saudi, Morocco, Oman, other countries as well. But I'd prefer to allow whichever countries we may be talking with the privacy to actually, really have these free discussions without the fear of things being leaked in ways that could harm the deals.
I had zero expectation of actually getting an answer to that question. I was just checking your diplomatic skills. You passed the flying colors.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, you passed. That was awesome. That was the greatest non-answer ever. Anyway, Avi, you're a young guy. How are you going to top this?
I think about that too. I don't like, I guess the question almost requires a little bit of arrogance to think that I've done so much. I've been part of a tremendous team of people who have made what my element of this accomplishment possible, specifically the president and Jared Kushner, who I've mentioned him a few times, but I have just such respect and appreciation to him. He really deserves so much credit. And I also deal with a lot of the media that he gets. So I see the criticisms, and it's sort of mind-boggling when you compare the amount of success that he's had to the absurdity of the criticism without them ever coming back on the flip side when he actually helps make peace in the Middle East. So I'll just take that quick second to congratulate him. But as it relates to me, I think about these things a lot. I hope that I will be forever surrounded by as many smart and accomplished people as I've been up until this point, so that I can continue to grow with them and accomplish more things.
Okay, well, we wish you much continued success, and thanks very much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me. It's great talking to you.
Okay, pleasure.
Hello, I'm Carolyn Glick. I'm a senior columnist at Israel Hayom, and thank you so much for joining us in this panel discussion where we're going to be talking about the regional implications of President Trump's leadership of peace in the Middle East through the Abraham Accords. And we have here with us in the studio in Jerusalem at the Government Press Office, we have Professor Eugene Kontorovich from George Mason University Law School and from the Kohelet Forum here in Jerusalem for policy. And we have Dr. Eddie Cohen, who is a senior researcher at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar-Ilan University. And with us remotely are Abdallah Junaid in Bahrain. He's a senior Bahraini journalist and policy analyst, and he's going to be speaking to us from Bahrain. And we have Rami Aziz. He's an Egyptian academic who's now currently at the University of Rome, and he'll be joining us as well to talk about the implications of the Abraham Accords and more generally of President Trump's vision for the Middle East and how it's being played out in their countries. So just very briefly, last month we saw the really historic event at the White House. I was very privileged to actually be at the White House for the ceremony for the signing of normalization and peace agreements between the State of Israel and the United Arab Emirates on the one hand and the Kingdom of Bahrain on the other. These were the first peace accords that Israel had signed with Arab countries since 1994 with the signing of the peace deal with Jordan. And there was something very different about these agreements from what we've seen. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that we're calling them normalization accords. And the reason why I find this notable is because in the two peace treaties that Israel signed in the past with Egypt and with Jordan, the Arab states that had signed the deals with us were very clear to stipulate that they would not implement the normalization clauses of the deals that they signed with Israel, which is very strange. You're signing an official peace, but yet you don't want to normalize your ties with Israel. And here we skipped over the whole question, peace, no peace, because of course, according to the UN Charter, the normal relations with among nations is supposed to be peaceful, and then it was just a question of normalizing them. So the fact, I think, that we jumped straight to normalization was one of the really sort of revolutionary and appealing aspects of this deal, and we saw it also in the warmth between the delegations at the White House last month. And the first question that I really want to open it up to the panel to discuss is, what changed here? You know, what is it about Trump's mediation of the ties between the State of Israel on the one hand and the UAE and Bahrain and then other states that Dr. Eddie Cohen is going to talk about? What is it that's different here that engendered these different kinds of relations and this different kind of agreement? So I have some ideas about the Israeli side, which we can talk about perhaps later, but I'd like Professor Eugene Kontorovich to start the discussion of the panelists about what really is different here, and how do you look at it?
Yeah, I think what made it possible in part for President Trump to successfully bring this about is he is not a Washington insider. He came from outside of Washington, from outside the world of business, and he did not buy in to what everybody knows in Washington. And in Washington, there's many things that everybody knows are true, that are repeated over and over by Middle East experts who have PhDs in the Middle East in Washington. And they've been said for decades, and they've become kind of like a religion, and completely unchecked by the facts. So, for example, one of these was that recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel would bring war with the Arab world. President Trump didn't believe it. he did it, and he saw that the Middle East experts were wrong. There was no war with the Arab world. So he also understood then that another thing that the Middle East experts said, that the central issue in Israeli-Arab relations has to be the Palestinians. That is the central axis, the only thing anyone cares about. That this was not a statement that was based on facts. So it has not been true for a long time. This reality had already changed. So President Trump didn't change the reality so much as recognize that it had been changed and not be religiously attached to this dogma. So relations between Israel and many of the Gulf states have been warm and good unofficially for a while. But previous administrations didn't want to recognize that because it would contradict this narrative that they believed in. And also it would show the mistake the previous administration made in the Iran deal, which allowed Iran to accelerate its nuclear weapons program. And the reality of the Middle East today is that so it's often been divided on axes. During the Cold War, it was a Soviet-U.S. axis, but now the main axis is those countries threatened by Persian imperialism, and those countries who have become victims of it or on the side of it. And that is the fissure that he recognized. He didn't create that, but he wasn't afraid to admit it. And also, as a businessman, he understood that normal countries, what they really want to do is they want to help their own interests, to advance their economies, to develop, and that these ideologies that were holding back the Middle East were not ideologies that were native to the Middle East. They were ideologies from Brussels, from the European Union, from Washington, that were being imposed on the region in a way that held everyone back. He didn't subscribe to this. So he said, we can go forward and just leave these ideas behind. And because he had not internalized this, what everyone knows to be true, he could see that, the emperor has no clothes, that it's all a fiction, and achieve a breakthrough. But I think the point is the breakthrough had been very close in a sense. You just had to recognize how close it is and not be ideologically against realizing it.
I think you're right. I think there's a lot of willful blindness that was going on, particularly in Washington and in the European Union, and frankly, also in the Israeli left. I think that one of the things that we've been talking about a lot of is whether you can have peace for peace or whether it's all it has to be Israel making concessions to the Palestinians in order for other countries in the Arab world and the Islamic world to be willing to meet Israel and see it as a partner and as a neighbor. And I think that one of the sort of revolutionary ideas that Prime Minister Netanyahu specifically has been pushing really since the outset of his political career is this idea that Israel has a lot to offer the countries of the region and really of the world, and that instead of talking about ourselves always in respect to the people who reject our right to exist, that we should be talking about ourselves and developing ourselves so that people understand that there's a basis for cooperation between them and Israel, whether we're talking about African countries or Latin American countries or, of course, our neighbors here in the region. And I think it's a very friendly and pragmatic way of looking at things, and also that's based upon a true understanding of what Israel has to offer. And I'd like to turn it over to you, Abdallah Junaid in Bahrain. You've actually been publishing and openly discussing relations between Israel and Bahrain for a few years. I think the first article that I saw that you had written about it, I think was in 2018, if I'm not mistaken. Perhaps I missed earlier ones. But I think we had Bahraini tourists already coming to Jerusalem well before the signing of the Abraham Accords. And I'd really like to understand, what is the thinking, what was the thinking in Bahrain, and how did Trump's arrival on the scene in 2017, of course, with his historic visit first to Riyadh and then to Jerusalem, this is his first trip as president, what kind of impact did that have in Bahrain?
I believe, Caroline, the will of the people jointly, and also the shift of the U.S. administration in terms of playing more pivotal role in encouraging all parties involved to take a step forward. That is the first. Second, the will of the people. I tend to agree with you in terms of encouraging people-to-people policy instead of state-to-state. And that had played a major role. Bahrain have hosted Jewish community. They are part of our fabric. They are part of our social history. So if they travel to Israel to see relatives or otherwise, it's again playing a role. And they are not seen or treated as Jews or part of Judaism before they are Bahraini. And this is quite an important factor in the whole equation. The other element here is definitely the invigorating historical or geographical history that was dormant for quite some time. I don't believe that the Israeli aspirations are different than the Bahrainis or UAE or the Saudis or the Omanis or Kuwait. So forging forward is what we all need to continue investing in, as people are not just states. We need institution, organization, NGOs and so on. Like the event today taking a place. I'm talking to you, to American, to Israeli, Arab, and we need to continue putting the ball forward instead of going back to old knowledge of history. I believe that the title of the agreement being called the Ibrahimi or the Ibrahim Peace Accord should be the main corner, because this is the historical common ground that unites all the people of this region. And if we lost focus, we will not deliver what we are promising to the future generation of a normalization or a normal relation between the people of the region. If we're gonna face challenges in the future, we need to face those challenges united. I mean, Iran is only part of the challenges, but I promise you what we'll be facing down the road 10 to 15 years is going to be totally different picture, different challenges. The biggest challenge now, or hurdle to go over, is speeding up the processes of making people to people engage at all levels. Second, we will be facing crossing over from the challenges resulted from the coronavirus and epidemic. Now, we need to focus also on the social impact, other challenges, destabilizing the Middle East. We have Syria, we have Iraq, we have Libya, we have a lot of issues that we need to really focus on. So I believe this region, through this new approach, could add a new element that will be empowering and enchanting a lot of prospect future.
I think it's such a beautiful sentiment that you just described here about the basis of friendship, that it really is the ancient brotherhood between Isaac and Ishmael in the Bible as the children of Abraham. Because, we talk a lot about the strategic shared interests that the parties to the Abraham Accord, and more widely, share vis-a-vis fighting or contending with a threat posed by the Muslim Brotherhood and its associated terrorist organizations from Al-Qaeda and Daesh to Hamas and others, and also the threat that Iran poses to the nations of the region. But I think it really is true that, like you said, that we're focusing on the national identity of the parties of the region, allowing Bahrainis to express themselves as Bahrainis, and Israelis, of course, to express ourselves as Israelis, and so on and so forth. And I think that the potential for friendship as a result of that we're all, in the words of our Psalms, that we're all able to cultivate our own fig tree and our own grapevine, and yet do it in friendship and offer each other what we have to offer on the basis of mutual respect is really a profound concept. And with that, I do want to move over to Eddie Cohen, and then pass it over afterwards to Rami Aziz, because I think that, first I want to talk a little bit about the potential, because we keep being told, oh yes, they're right down the pike, right away, we're going to have another country or two that's going to be joining in. And I want to talk to you really about, how the countries of the region who weren't at the signing ceremony at the White House view this, and the potential for them and what it really means to them. So, Dr. Eddie Cohen, can you give me a sense really of what's happening? How are the other countries in the region looking at what's going on? And looking at Trump?
Eventually, almost all the Arab countries, at the end of this other day, will normalize the relation with Israel. Now we are talking about Sudan. Israel had a lot to give to Sudan. I spoke with many Sudanese people. I had an interview with the first time for Israeli in a Sudani magazine. The Sudanese, they said, we are not Arabs, we are Africans. They said, the Palestinian cause, it's not linked to us. We don't care about the Palestinian cause. And I want to tell you something, what you asked Eugene before. What happened? You ask him, what happened? Why now? The Palestinian issue is dead in their mind of the Arab leaders. Right. Believe me, Caroline. Maybe not among the Arab population, but in the Arab mind, this cause is dead. Why? Why now? The corruption in the PA, the endless war between Fatah and Hamas, the PA refused the aid of UAE, the Emirate aid for the coronavirus. People are dying. In Chairman Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, refused to receive this aid from UAE. This is unacceptable. The Arab leaders want security. Why? Israel will help them militarily? Of course not. Some Israelis think that because of Iran, these countries will normalize with Israel. No, that's not true. Israel will not send aircraft to help the Gulf countries. The American administration has, as you know, dozens of bases also in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait. The British are there. So this is not the real cause. The real cause that these countries, these Arab leaders, want to be part of the Western world. They want to be part of the civilized world. They see their interest, the interest of their people. They want technology. They want to come to Israel to see this country. They want a cultural, they want to meet the Jewish people. So they have their enemy. Their enemy is Iran.
Well, what's holding them back?
They suffered a lot with the Obama administration. They suffered a lot with this administration. They believe, I spoke with many Arabs every day. Arab intellectual thinks that the Democratic Party is linked with the brother Muslims. And I think yes also. They think surely that Biden administration will bring back the Iranian
okay, we're
agreement.
We're going to talk about that in the next round, but I'm wondering specifically, what is it about what Trump has been doing that has brought this all above the table for the first time?
He said, my way or the highway. Trump, who decide? Let's be clear. Who decide? Who protects these leaders?
The US.
America, the U.S. You want to be king? You want to still be the king? Say what I'm saying. Do what I say. That's it.
And so it was the American leadership that has pushed this above the table.
Definitely. Trump leadership pushed the Arabs, and also the Arab leaders saw the truth. They saw that the enemy is not Israel. They saw the failed cause, the Palestinian cause. All these elements, plus Trump charismatic administration, pushed the Arab leaders to do this miracles accords.
So do you think that Sudan is down the pike? Where's Oman? What are they
Sudan.
going to do?
Last year in Sudan, there was a coup d'etat. Omar al-Bashir is in jail. He was Muslim Brotherhood. So now, these days, there's another administration or rulers, Sudanese leader, very open, Brigadier Abraham. He met Prime Minister Netanyahu. Sudan needs technology. Sudan needs water. Sudan needs Israel. They told me, we need technology. We need investment. Now it's on the list of terror, U.S. list terror. They want to remove it. Trump told them, normalize with Israel, we will remove. We'll bring investment. We'll bring money. We'll bring jobs, technology. The Sudanese has what kind of dispute we have with the Sudanese government? Nothing.
You know, it's interesting, and I want to move over to Rami a second. You know, I remember, what Eddie is saying is he's portraying this as really very much a function, so much of what's moving of American leadership. And I look at Israel's relations with Egypt, and I'm thinking of two things. One is former Defense Secretary Don Rumsfeld wrote in his memoir that came out several years ago that every time that he met with President Mubarak in Cairo, that Mubarak sort of would start the conversation by saying, we support the Palestinians. And then he would move on to whatever it was that he wanted to discuss with Rumsfeld, and that Rumsfeld was sort of unique among American policymakers who looked at, and he wrote about it, that he felt that in Mubarak's case, every time that he talked about the Palestinians, it was sort of the same thing as clearing his throat. Like it was a formality that he felt he had to say, and then he went on to the next thing. And what we're seeing really, I feel like with Israel and Egypt, I want to understand how important Trump is, because I saw already with the overthrow of Mubarak with American support, which we'll talk more about maybe if we have more time in the second round, but that Israel was instrumental in getting congressional support for al-Sisi when the military came in under public pressure and overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood government that was formed there, that was there for 10 months with Morsi. And that the Israeli-Egyptian relations really started, expanding during the Obama administration, when both sides saw that they really, for the first time, recognized that they could be allies with each other. So I wanted you to talk about that, and also about, well, what changed with Trump then? What is it about what Trump has done that has really changed things from an Egyptian perspective?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for my best regards to all colleagues. Your question is very accurate. It's a wonderful question. You mentioned a very important and sensitive point in the relationship between Egypt, Israel, and U.S. For Mubarak for a long time, during his term, 30 years, consider himself as a broker for peace between Israeli and the Palestinians. And he, let me say it frankly, in direct way, he considered Palestinian cause is his own business. One is the strong paper using to put pressure over the different American administration to get benefits from the United States. He did a grave mistakes to Egypt before the United States, before Israel, because he limited the relationship between the strategic, important relationship between U.S., Israel, and peace between us only to Palestinian cause. Instead of Israel and Egypt has many other perspectives can working together. For Sisi, the issue is completely different. Sisi realized well that Israel and Palestinian cause shouldn't be linked to each other. he doing his best to help the Palestinian people, but at the same time, he looking for the Egyptian-Israeli benefits, the Egyptian-Israeli common interest. Let us give an example. When the Obama administration suspended a significant, important military equipment in 2016 during our sensitive time when Egypt had a serious war against ISIS branch in Sinai, the only country supported us in the intelligence level, military level, was Israel. So we realized well that our neighbors is more close for us than the United States. That was a very sharp mistake from the former administration. I want to make it clear here enough to differentiate between the United States and the different administration. We here are talking about Obama administration. You know what happened to the Egyptian people? The public opinion towards the United States during Obama administration was awful. The Egyptians started to say the United States is our enemy. And instead of this long decades of strategic alliances between Egypt and the United States after Camp David agreement, the Egyptians said the United States is our enemy. In spite of this billions of dollars we received from the United States and the significant unlimited aids we received from the United States, but during this sensitive time when Obama's administration supported the Muslim Brotherhood and ignored the desires of Egyptian people to overthrow the religious ruling between two quotations, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Egyptian turned to Russia and started to say, Russia is our friend, the United States is our enemy. So what I'd like to say here is Obama administration get a sharp harm to Egyptian-American relationship. So President Trump from day one realizes that Egypt is very important. He shouldn't let Egypt go away from the United States. He worked hardly to maintain the relationship between Egypt and the United States. He received the President Sisi as a House Vice for the first time in April in earlier 2017. He released all the suspended and economic sanction over the Egyptian regime, and he returned the military aid to Egypt, and he supported Egypt significantly in the international arena and in its war against terrorism in Sinai.
And did that really, I know that obviously had an impact on U.S.-Egyptian strategic ties after the Obama administration. Did it have impact on public opinion of the United States as well among Egyptians?
Again, I can't hear you.
The public perception of the United States. You said that Egyptians, for the first time since Camp David under Obama, began looking at the United States as their adversary, as their enemy. Did that change? Has that changed over the past 3 years of the Trump administration?
Yeah, completely. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. From day one, President Trump gave Egypt, not only President Sisi. When he supported the Sisi, he supported Egypt. So the Egyptian people realized that that the new president who sits in the White House, he is not supported for the Muslim Brotherhood. Is not supported for our enemies. He supports the Egyptian state. He will do his best to prevent the collapse of the Egyptian state. He supported Egypt not only in its fight against terrorism, against ISIS, but in economic level, in diplomatic level. The Trump administration did a significant things to Egypt and to Egyptian people.
Okay. All right. So I think, I was planning on going back to you, Eugene, but I think I want to actually start the second round with you, Abdallah, in Bahrain, if you don't mind. We'll just change a little bit the plan, because I think, now that he mentioned the sort of distinction between the Obama administration and how they were perceived by the Egyptian people for their support for the Muslim Brotherhood and, of course, their nuclear deal with Iran, what I was wondering, we're looking forward, just next month we're going to have presidential elections in the United States. From an Israeli perspective, the stakes are very high from our perspective, because the Obama administration was the most hostile administration towards Israel really in the history of U.S.-Israeli relations. And Biden has promised to reinstate all of Obama's policies, both towards the PLO and the Palestinians and also towards Iran. He's pledged a number of times, and the entire Democratic Party has pledged a number of times to reinstate America's commitment to the nuclear deal with Iran, which of course we all know will give Iran an open road to a nuclear bomb within just, a year or so. So, and of course, the UN weapons embargo against Iran is supposed to end now, at the end of October. So we're talking about, from an Israeli perspective, the vast majority of Israelis support Trump, and because of all of the things that he's seen. And so going forward, on the one hand, the positive part, if Trump is reelected and we have sort of a continuation of the policies that we've seen over the past 3.5 years, what do you think, how do you put Bahrain in that picture? Where do you think it's going to lead? And also, what do you see from a Bahraini perspective as the future for us under a third Obama administration for short-term purposes, for shorthand purposes, which is basically what we'd be getting with Joe Biden, who's vice president?
I think, Caroline, probably one of the most important points is for all of us, Bahrain, UAE, Kuwait, all the GCC nationals, and also for Israelis, to depart from yesterday's narrative. We need to engage each other to the different things. Eddie was talking about Obama forcing our leadership to accept something like this, and I must state my reservation on such a statement. We had suffered under the Obama administration for 8 years and tried for a regime change in all the regions. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, Kuwait, Oman, but we stood up to that administration and we survived without the need. And the U.S. forces that he was describing being there to defend us against Iran, at that time, they were in cahoots with Iran and Turkey to divide the whole Middle East between Iran and Turkey. So what we need to do, first of all, to understand, are we apprehensive in terms of a third term for the Obama administration? Yes, we are apprehensive. Are we pessimistic? We are definitely pessimistic. But can we, as a region, stand up with the help of Israel or without the help of Israel? I'm sure we can go another round with the U.S. administration. But definitely, as a region, forging forward, we definitely value Israel as a friend going forward from this point out.
And I think, it's very interesting because one of the many things that Trump has been criticized for since he really started running for president in 2015 is his nationalism, is what he refers to as his nationalism, that he wants to promote America first. But I think that what we're hearing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Abdallah, but I think nationalism is sort of something that's shared by the nations of the world, that we love our country, we love our fellow citizens of our country. Certainly this is true in Israel, and we're proud of our nation and our national identity. And I think that the real question is, if I respect and love myself and my nation, then I can probably be a good friend to the Bahrainis, to the Egyptians who love their country and their fellow people, and that really it is the national identity that we have, our attachment to our countries, that lets us go out into the world and be good allies and partners to other nations. And so, Eugene, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the nationalism and how this is going to play out either in a second Trump term or really what's going to happen to these burgeoning alliances between nations if we have another post-nationalist American government that sees the world in terms of worlds, which is sort of an imperialist way if we look at, from the Yoram Chazoni's dichotomy between nationalism and imperialism, the Sunni Islamic empire, which would be led by a Turkey or Daesh or whatever that is, or Wahhabis, whatever, so that you have a sort of a Sunni imperial perspective and a Shiite imperial perspective of Iran. So where is that sort of the basis of the nationalism versus versus pan-nationalism or post-nationalism that we would see in a Biden administration versus a second Trump term?
First of all, I think that you make a very important point that when one values, people might say, what is Israel, Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, what do they have in common? They're all nations. Right? They're all nations, and if one nations with great pride in themselves, and if one thinks that like a nation or nationalism is a bad thing, one is less able to conceptually and instinctively resist imperialism, and that is why I think the Obama administration was ineffectual in the face of Iranian imperialism, which is what it is. Iran was taking over more and more Arab nations, but if you think that the nation is unimportant, then then who cares? I think that the spirit that comes from Washington affects the whole world, and the kind of just the mood that comes from Washington, it has a great effect on the whole world. And we can see that, even aside from the Middle East, during the Trump presidency, for example, the European Union has been much less aggressive in its campaign to isolate or boycott Israel. They went on vacation. They really toned it down. It's not that their views have changed. It's that no one wants to go against Washington. And the mood set in Washington sets the tone for the whole world. So even for example, though the Gulf states had relations and had ties with Israel during the Obama administration, the open embrace of Israel by Trump makes it easier for everyone to get on board. So countries that were already sympathetically inclined, like the UAE, can have open relations. Europe, which is not sympathetic, is going to be less overtly aggressive. So a change even in mood from Washington, even aside from any concrete policies, and there's going to be very different policies also, of course, with regards to Iran, we should worry about it because it will, I think, has the potential to slow down and dampen the movement of real Middle East peace, which is what we are seeing now. Which is why I was very encouraged by what Abdullah said. The alternative is for the countries of the region to understand that the Biden administration is not going to have their backs against Iran, and not to be influenced by this mood. And if Biden is elected, to know that Trump has allowed us to get this far, but from here on, the countries of the Middle East, Israel and the Gulf states need to take it the rest of the way themselves, and not let a bad wind from Washington disturb their improving relations. But I definitely think sort of the pace of peace in the Middle East is one of the things that is at stake in this election.
I think you're very right. And so let me just turn it to you, Eddie. I mean, you were talking earlier about how the Obama administration is very much associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. Just how much of a danger is the Muslim Brotherhood still? After all, the Trump administration did decimate, for instance, Daesh, ISIS in Syria and in Iraq. I mean, there's been some sort of a renaissance of Daesh in certain areas there. But, has he done enough on the ground and also sort of in people's heads to enable the kind of camaraderie that we're discovering with our regional neighbors to be maintained in a Biden administration? How will the nations view their own interests going forward in a Biden administration, and of course, obviously, in a second Trump administration?
The two dangerous things on the Arab world is Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood. Definitely, you can ask any Arab in the Gulf area, in Syria, in Iraq, they will tell you Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, you spoke about the Muslim Sunni countries. We used in Israel to focus on these countries several years ago in the media, but now it's changed. Now we have two sides. We have one side, Qatar, Turkey, and Iran. Qatar and Turkey are Sunni, and Iran is Shiite. Against the other, Egypt, UAE, Bahrain, Israel, USA. So we cannot speak about now Sunnis and Shiite. The pact, the Turkish, Iranian, Qatar pact is against the peace process. They don't want peace. I met a lot of people in the Gulf, in the Bahraini people. They are so kind. I met Saudis. I met also UAE. They want peace. They don't care now. They don't peace. They were afraid. There were these concepts about the Palestinian issue. Now they want peace. Which problem, which dispute I have with Mr. Abdallah? We haven't have any war together. There's no dispute. Why not? Shall we make peace? Why not? Why not? We cannot make peace with them, and we can visit each other.
So what about a Biden administration?
Biden, unfortunately, if I were Muslim, Arab, American, I would vote for Trump. Definitely. Biden will bring Iran. Iran is destroying the Arab countries. Iran is destroying Iraq, destroyed Iraq. Lebanon is dominated by Hezbollah, by Iran. Syria, Assad Syria, and also Yemen. Iran is destroying all the Arab countries. Biden will lift the sanction on Iran. Biden will have more ties with the Muslim Brotherhood. I think that Donald Trump, if he will be elected, he will consider the Muslim Brotherhood as a terror organization. I think he will do it. And he will do it, he will save the Arab world from them.
Well, Rami, let me just ask you a final question. So Egypt was the biggest threat that Israel faced for our first 4 decades of existence, or 3. And then we were kind of in a very cold peace. It was really just a long-term ceasefire between Egypt and Israel. And Mubarak, as you said, was, he was playing both sides against one another in many ways. And now we have a very close cooperation with the Sisi government. How do you see things going? The turbulence that the Obama administration brought to Egypt, the instability, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood. How do you see, how strong is Egypt going forward? How is the regime looking at the threat that a pro-Muslim Brotherhood U.S. administration would pose for its very existence? And where do you see the future of Israel-Egypt ties, either under a second Trump administration or going forward with a third Obama administration under Biden?
Yeah. Thanks again for this good question. The people in Egypt, not only the government, they have a fear about returning of Obama administration. You said something, I will quote it. You said the third Obama administration. If Biden have succeeded to be in the office, he will be an extension for Obama and Hillary Clinton's. And to know what they are going to do, you need just to read the Hillary Clinton emails to understand the realities and facts. We are not talking here about the speculation. We now have evidence, clear evidence about what happened, about the volume of damage they caused to our economy, to our people, to our countries, So the Egyptians are very keen about the future of the United States and who will be the president. If Trump stay re-elected for another term, I think everything will be stable, will move forward between Egypt and Israel. But the good thing is, if Biden becomes a president, even the Egyptian-Israeli relationship will be strong. Now the Arab people, including Egypt, realize it well that the region should depend about its own selves. We shouldn't wait the help from outside, even if it's come from the United States. The difference between what President Trump brought to the region immediately, he has a common interest like Obama to withdraw from the region. But the difference is Obama withdrew from the region and delivered the region to Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood and Turkey and Qatar, and he sent billions of dollars to Iran as a reward for them after signing the nuclear deal in 2015. But Trump wanted to withdraw from the region, but before withdrawal, he wanted to establish a good coalition, very strong, solid coalition between moderate Sunni countries and Israel to protect the region and to take care for the region, to develop the region. We are not talking here only about military action. There is many things Arab countries, Arab Sunni moderate countries can do with Israel on technology level and water level. Egypt will have a problem with water shortly, according to the current crisis situation between Egypt and Ethiopia and others. You know, so we have many things to do. So the good thing is that Egyptian people realize it, and the Arab people in general realize it well, that we can't live away from Israel for a long time. Let me use and quoted the recent survey here by Zogby organization. 58% of the Egyptian people looking positively to Israel, and they willingness to have a good relationship with Israel. We are talking about 59% in Saudi and Jordan. We're talking about 56% of the people in Emirates are looking for a good cooperation and different perspective with Israel. So everything has changed. The future is for the cooperation between Arab moderated Sunni countries and Israel, regardless who is sitting in the White Office. But let me say something frankly. This is a direct fruit for the President Trump action towards the Middle East. He pushed the Arab leaders to be in public relationship with Israel. We have a good, the most of Arab countries, Gulf states, they have a good relationship with Israel for decades, but behind the closed door. President Trump said, enough is enough. We should to be in.
I think you're absolutely right, Rami. I think that this has been an incredible discussion, and I think that one of the things that we really take away from here is just how exactly what Rami said, and I think it's an important place to end, which is that what Obama wanted to do was leave the area and transfer it to the imperial powers of the Iranians and the Muslim Brotherhood. And what Trump has done that's been so revolutionary, and that we can look forward to if we can look forward to another 4 years with him, it will be extraordinary. And if not, we'll survive, because what he did was he unlocked the belief that we could move forward as individual nations, that we can trust ourselves, that we can defend ourselves, and that working together we're going to be able to accomplish shared goals, whether they're in technology and in fighting the coronavirus on the one hand, or water technologies, or really whether it's facing our common adversaries in the Muslim Brotherhood and its assorted terrorist organizations, or whether it's facing Iran and its assorted terrorist organizations in places like Lebanon and Syria and beyond. So I think that this has been an incredible discussion. I think we have a great deal to thank President Trump for his visionary leadership and his iconoclasm, which has unleashed the imaginations and the cooperations of the nations of this region. And I thank you all for a really fruitful discussion, and I hope we'll have a lot more of them, even in person at the end of the coronavirus. We'll welcome all of you and your friends from the UAE to Jerusalem. Thank you very much.
Caroline, quickly, can I add something quickly, if you allow to me?
I think we're out of time.
But quickly.
Why don't we do it? If we can do it, yes. If you can put it in, that'd be great. We'd love to hear more. Yes.
Yeah, quickly, I would like to say something. I'm a natural analysis for the Middle East affairs, observing the situation carefully. What I'm going to say here is not advertising for President Trump. I'm talking as a natural researcher and analyst. But I'd like to say, if the people of Middle East have the right to vote inside the coming American administration, they will vote for Trump, because that is for them mean more stability and more security, and no return for their actual move near Muslim Brotherhood and Iran again.
I think you're right. I think there was just a poll that came out that said, I don't know whether it's 63 or 68% of Israelis would be voting for Trump as well, which is probably even better than he's getting in Alabama. Anyway, take care, both of you, and both of you here with me, and hopefully we'll see a lot more of you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shalom. I'd like to first thank my colleagues at the Shiloh Policy Forum, Attorney Bentzi Lieberman, the chairman, and Dr. Anat Roth, the CEO, for putting this amazing conference together, and to Professor Moshe Koppel, the chairman of the Kohelet Policy Forum, and to Attorney Meir Rubin, the CEO. For the past 2 years, my colleagues and I have been working on a structure for Israeli-Palestinian relations that offers a new paradigm to the well-known, time-worn, and failed alternatives. Although we have not yet published the plan, we are encouraged by recent developments, which conform and in large measure complement our plan. By recent developments, I refer to the following. First, the Trump administration's focus on increased economic development instead of the continuing endless entanglement in issues that have no immediate solution. 2, the deepening of the formal entente between the Gulf states and Israel. Thirdly, the voices rising from the Palestinian public calling for more employment opportunities and economic growth. We are hoping to unveil our full plan in the coming weeks, but today I want to present a small yet important part of it in the context of this auspicious conference and in the context of the idea of a new Middle East. Announcing a new Middle East prematurely, as it was done some 25 years ago, is a fantasy. But not realizing a new Middle East when it's really happening is a tragedy. We believe that a new Middle East is finally emerging, but it will remain new and promising only if we act expeditiously. Otherwise, there are forces of evil that will bring us down. It is impossible to approach the new reality with a narrow and constricting vision. We need to get out of the shtetl mindset, set aside all the tired slogans. We need to think big. If you find it hard to imagine that the Jordan Valley can be an engine of economic growth, think for a second about the Tennessee Valley, where millions were lifted out of poverty through large-scale infrastructure and industrial development. True, different valleys, but it can help us create a vision and a plan. We propose an international industrial free trade zone be established in the Jordan Valley. It will stretch over an area of 42,000 dunam, 26,000 on the Israeli side, and 16,000 on the Jordanian side. In miles, this would mean 16,000 square miles. The area can accommodate employment for 250,000 people in 300 to 400 factories, offices, and logistical centers. Construction of the project will immediately require approximately 75,000 workers in fields such as construction and another 15,000 to 20,000 in ancillary services such as transportation, earthworks, and road construction. Because of its location, the zone will serve as the regional economic nerve center and logistics terminal for the existing small industrial zones in Jordan, for the joint Israeli-Palestinian industrial zones in Judea and Samaria, and for the Israeli-Jordanian project already underway in the northern Jordan Valley called the Jordan Gate Project. Why such a grandiose project, and why now? The result of simultaneous developments, there is a constellation of factors worth exploiting. First, as I already mentioned, the dramatic change brought about by the Trump administration when it comes to seeking peace with the Palestinians. No more wasteful emphasis on solving unsolvable problems. Rather than allow stagnation to rule the day, focus on economic prosperity and quality of life issues. The second development is the growing U.S. need to reduce the huge rate of U.S. imports from China in order to stop the suffocating dependence of the U.S. economy on the Chinese economy. We'll see in a moment how this seemingly unrelated issue is very much related. This was true before the corona crisis, and the need has now grown exponentially. And the third development is the abolition of the Arab boycott of Israel, with the agreements that have already been signed with the Gulf states, the Abraham Accords, and those yet to come. And now, enter Jordan into this historic constellation. Why? It's no secret that the stability of the Hashemite kingdom is in everyone's interest. The relentless violence in Iraq, the civil war in Syria, and the Iranian threat spreading instability throughout the region puts Jordan in a most precarious position. The anti-Iranian alliance and the economic access created following the Abraham Accords under the semi-transparent sponsorship of Saudi Arabia strengthens Jordan, Israeli interests, and American interests in the region with stable and united allies. The Trump administration also rightly wants Jordan to play an important role where the Palestinians are concerned. It is an open secret that the Palestinian population is much more interested in economic cooperation with Israel than is the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinians, with unemployment rates in Judea and Samaria climbing above 18% prior to the corona crisis, and an 85% drop in PAA revenues, are in serious need of large-scale economic development. The economic situation in Jordan as a result of the crisis is also difficult. Unofficial estimates put the unemployment rate in Jordan at 30% and acute poverty at close to 20%. These figures do not include the hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees, perhaps over 1 million, who have flooded the country in recent years following the Syrian civil war, debilitating the Jordanian economy even further. At the same time, Jordan is well suited for dramatic industrial expansion precisely in the areas of industry required to offset the American imports from China. Commercial coordination between Israel and Jordan as part of the Trump program may be a key component to the program's success. Both Israel and Jordan have free trade agreements with the U.S., allowing for competitive pricing vis-a-vis China. There is great potential for cooperation between Israel and Jordan as geopolitical conditions have matured. Jordan is ranked among the top 10 countries as an outsourcing destination and among the top 10 countries in launching startup companies. It has an educated and entrepreneurial sector that yearns for growth. Already about 25% of Jordanian exports are to the United States, and increasing exports exponentially is, of course, win-win. Israel brings to the table experience, stability, and a great deal of knowledge. Its innovative base has made it the startup nation and an economic powerhouse. All this is doubly true now that the Gulf states are interested in establishing close ties, economic ties with Israel, while also contributing to the Jordanian and Palestinian economies. This is clearly reflected not only in the intention of the agreements, but in the actual wording of the agreements. It appears that the best potential for joint development is in 4 areas of industry. These are examples, and they are by no means exclusive. First, pharmaceuticals. The corona crisis has exposed America's enormous dependence on China in the field of pharmaceuticals. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce, China is the source of 95% of the ibuprofen, 91% of the hydrocortisone, 70% of the Tylenol, 45% of penicillin, 40% of heparin, 90% of vitamin C, and 80% of the antibiotics in the United States are sourced in China. Jordan has 17 drug companies that employ about 26,000 workers. Jordan is the only Arab country that exports more pharmaceutical products than it imports. 75% is exported to 60 countries. But at the present time, the pharmaceutical industry is in decline and constitutes only 5% of total exports, whereas in the past it was close to 8-9%. Exports to the U.S. currently stand at a paltry $45 million. Even a small chunk of the Chinese industry will increase those numbers significantly. Cooperation and the expansion of the pharmaceutical sectors of Israel and Jordan can turn this critical area of U.S. imports from China onto more reliable ground. Fabrics and textiles. The textile industry in Jordan is highly developed. It employs 25% of the Jordanian labor force and accounts for almost 35% of total exports. There are currently about 85 large textile factories in Jordan employing 77,000 people and another 20,000 working in small local companies. Jordan's textile exports total $2.1 billion, of which $1.5 billion goes to the United States. Textile imports from China to the United States, and this is by no means an intention of comparing Jordan to China. Nobody could compare it to China, but it is merely to demonstrate the market capability that can be capitalized on. Textile imports from China to the United States stand at $35 billion. In addition, the United States purchases another $27 billion in sports equipment and games and spends $19 billion on plastic products. For these 3 sectors, in which the total U.S. imports from China stand at $76 billion, there are efficient production lines in Jordan with a capable and yearning labor force. All that is needed is to expand the industries that already exist. expanding the production of textiles, along with the establishment of new factories for the production of fabrics, which are currently imported to Jordan, the production of innovative and advanced plastics and sports equipment can increase natural production fourfold in a relatively short amount of time. Precision agriculture and processed fruits and vegetables. Processed fruits and vegetables are another area in industrial development that produces a win-win situation for all involved. The U.S. currently spends $1.2 billion per annum on imports of processed fruits and vegetables from China, $400 million on natural fruit drinks, 70% of the entire market in the United States, $222 million on fruit-based snacks, $167 million on spices, and $160 million on fresh vegetables. Total imports from Jordan in this area are a bare $12 million, $1 million on spices and $1 million on vegetables. Israel's knowledge of precision agriculture will dramatically advance the small agro-tech industry in Jordan. Growth of the agricultural processing industry will help small and medium-sized farms because it will significantly increase the demand for their products and increase employment opportunities even outside of the free zone itself. Raw materials and fertilizer production. Jordan is rich in many types of minerals, but phosphate and potash, used among other things to produce fertilizers, are Jordan's main mineral wealth and the country's second largest export. This is also an industry that could benefit from dramatic expansion, since the fourth largest supplier of fertilizers to the United States is China, which produces 5 million tons a year, 2.5 million going to the United States. Israel is the sixth largest supplier of potash in the world, and Jordan the seventh. The merging of Israeli technological advances with the Jordanian and Palestinian production capabilities for all the above, within the framework of existing free trade agreements with the United States, will be a winning combination. The location of the free trade and industrial zone. Transportation networks to the ports. A 4-lane highway will connect the zone to the Fatsael Junction and Highway number 5. From Fatsael, the Ariel Junction, the road will continue as a 2-lane highway with 4-lane travel resumed between Ariel and Highway number 6. At Highway 6, transportation will continue northward to Haifa until Highway 75 and southward to Ashdod on 6 until Highway 7. A rail line will be planned and implemented along this route as well. It will run from the Free Trade Zone to the Qasim Junction, where it will link with existing and planned rail lines running to both the Haifa and Ashdod ports. On the Jordanian side, the zone will connect with the capital of Amman via Highway 65 and then Highway 40. The area north of Amman, where small qualified industrial zones already exist, will connect with the zone via Highway 30 and then Highway 65 to the south. The port of Aqaba for relevant goods will also be accessible through existing roadways. 2 bridges, one on the north end of the zone and one on the southern tip, will connect the Israeli and Jordanian sides, allowing for the consistent and easy flow of goods and personnel. The larger plan will include a land port in Samaria near the intersection of Highways 5 and 6. The port is intended to streamline port services in Haifa and Ashdod. It will significantly improve trade relations between the Israeli and Palestinian economies, and most importantly, it will deploy economic space for the Palestinians, opening a gateway for them to both the east through the Free Trade Zone and, of course, to the west through Israel's Mediterranean ports. What I described above must be complemented with infrastructure corridors that will service the industrial park and the Free Trade Zone, as well as all peoples on both sides of the Jordan. What do I mean by an infrastructure corridor? An infrastructure corridor is a subterranean tunnel containing several types of infrastructure lines such as water, sewage, energy, gas, fuel, oil, electricity, communications, and even fiber optics. These are also transportation corridors as they run parallel to highway and rail lines. The passage of national infrastructures through a single multi-system conduit has numerous advantages, which will be explained later in this conference by Dr. Shimon Farang, their architect. An economic space that seeks to generate growth and prosperity must be supported by an advanced infrastructure system complementing the needs of industrial production as well as the surrounding populations. The size and capacity of the free trade zone will require large-scale infrastructure planning in order to secure utility requirements such as power and water. Beyond the zone, Jordan itself suffers from a severe shortage of water, ranked fourth in the world for water scarcity. And its needs for natural gas extend well beyond its current supply. Jordan has a growing energy demand on the one hand, but a very limited domestic resource to fulfill this demand on the other. The local production of energy, including crude oil, natural gas, and renewable energy, covers a mere 5% of the country's energy consumption. The country's limited domestic resources make Jordan almost completely dependent on imported energy. This is a huge drain on the economy, comprising a full 17% of the country's GDP. In the past, one of the main sources of the imported energy was Egypt, from where Jordan imported natural gas. However, there have been acute problems with service disruption due to ISIS terror on the Sinai Peninsula, which has critically compromised Jordan's energy security situation. A direct, much shorter and dependable supply line from Israel's massive natural gas reservoir would be an effective alternative, allowing for resource diversification and security. Infrastructure corridors running from Israel's coast to Jordan's population and industrial concentrations would answer those critical needs as well of those all along the corridor routes, Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians. This plan proposes the construction of an infrastructure corridor from north to south with 4 routes from east to west for the passage of water from the Israeli desalination plants located along Israel's coast, as well as natural gas from the new reservoirs in Israel's territorial waters. The infrastructure corridors will help strengthen cooperation between Israel and the Palestinians and Jordan, leverage the development and economic growth of the region, and significantly improve the standard of living for everyone. If we allow the courage of our imagination a bit more space, we can imagine the free trade zone sitting on infrastructure corridors running all the way to the Gulf. Like the ancient Silk Road, bringing business and trade from the Far East to the West and back. In the new Middle East, unique peoples from unique places should be able to grow and prosper together. Only this time they will trade their goods on highways and high-speed rails. In conclusion, it can be argued that the project is too grandiose to be successful, but the exact opposite can also be argued. Precisely because it has a grand vision, it can succeed. We aren't in Tennessee, but neither is the river that Abraham crossed. The Jordan Valley Free Trade and Industrial Zone can be the first bridge over the troubled waters of the Middle East. Recent events in our region are comprehensive and dramatic. They require that we respond accordingly. The Gulf states think big. The United States does everything big. And Israel, though tiny in size, is poised at the intersection of 3 great continents with a big role to play for everyone's benefit. A real new Middle East will surely reflect that. Thank you.
רפורמות כלכליות ושינויים במדיניות הכלכלית פתחו למעשה את שווקי המדינות למעבר חופשי של סחורות, שירותים, הון, מידע ואנשים, ותרמו למעשה להתפתחותו של שוק גלובלי אחד. עם התפתחות הטכנולוגית למעשה גברה הדרישה לניידות ולנגישות לאספקת אנרגיה ולמקורות מידע, ולימים הפכו תשתיות חוצי גבולות לאורכי חיים חשובים. מכאן אנחנו עוברים לצורך בפרוזדור תשתיות, שהוא למעשה מחבר מספר מדינות. מהו פרוזדור תשתיות? הוא רצועה ליניארית שבתוכה ממוקמים החל מרכבת מהירה, כביש דו-מסלולי מהיר, וכלה בצדדים בתשתיות שונות כמו נפט, גז, מים, ומצד שני חשמל, קווי תקשורת וכולי. כל הפרוזורים הידועים לנו, כולם נמצאים בתוך רצועה ליניארית, שמצד אחד משרתת בין המדינות, ומצד שני משרת את הסביבה. לדוגמה, כאן אנחנו רואים פה בסכמה, שמופיעים פה קווי התשתיות, ולמעשה הכפרים שנמצאים בסמוך, והיישובים בסמוך, הם גם ניזונים מלבד המוצא והיעד של המערכת הפרוזדור. פרוזדור תשתיות הוא למעשה תוצר של שיתוף פעולה טריטוריאלי בין המדינות. הוא יוצר מנופים כלכליים, הוא משפר את המערכות השירותיים, מגדיל את המסחר ואת ההשקעות הישירות הזרות, מצמצם את העוני באמצעות צמיחה, כלכלה והגדלת אפשרויות התעסוקה. הוא יוצר יציבות כלכלית ולמעשה הוא משפר את התחרות, הנגישות והרחבת פוטנציאל השוק. מטרת הפרוזדור הוא בעצם, הפרוזדורי תשתיות הם בעצם לחזק את השיתוף הפעולה בין המדינות סביב קיומו של מזרון תשתיות משותף והפיכתו לעורק חיים. קיצור הטווחים הגיאוגרפיים בין המדינות בתחבורה ובתזרים סחורות, למעשה הוא בעצם מקצר את המונחים של זמן ועלות. הוא מאפשר גם לייעל את השימוש במשאבי הקרקע, מאחר וכל המשאבים מופיעים בצורה אחת. הוא מצמצם את הפגיעה, הוא מצמצם את הפגיעה הסביבתית שנגרמת עם הקמה של כל תשתית בנפרד. זה מה שמקובל היום, כל תשתית נמצאת בנפרד. כאן מערכת של תשתיות נמצאות בפרוזדור אחד, בוודאי שהם יצמצמו את טביעת הרגל האקולוגית בשטח. בנוסף הוא יאפשר את מרבית מגוון של ספקים להצטרף לתוך הפרוזדור ויחסוך בעלויות ההקמה על ידי ריבוי משתמשים והשקעה. תכנון וסלילה של פרוזדור תשתיות הוא למעשה אתגר תכנוני ממדרגה ראשונה. קידום פרוזדור תשתיות הינו תהליך אסטרטגי מורכב מאוד, הוא מבוסס על תכנון לטווח ארוך עם תחזיות, צרכים, ביקושים, חוסר ודאות סביב מאפייני השירות העתידיים ומידת הגמישות הנדרשת. הסיבה לכך היא המורכבות, אתגרי התיאום שצריך פה ושיתוף הפעולה והתמודדויות עם ניגודי אינטרסים. דבר נוסף זה התוויה נכונה של פרוזדור תשתיות תאפשר יצירת מערך סינרגטי. מצד אחד תנועה והזרמת סחורות ממוצא ליעד, ומאידך פיתוח של אזורים פריפריאליים במרכב הכפרי שבעצם גובל בפרוזדור. קיימת אמנם אתגר נוסף שהוא בעצם תכנון של מערכת תשתיות ברצועת קרקע אחת שסמוכים זה לזה, זה אתגר תכנוני וניהולי. הסכם אברהם, פיתוח פרוזדור תשתיות במזרח התיכון החדש. הסכם אברהם הוא יוצר תוכנית מהפכנית במזרח התיכון, על לקח שיוצר בסיס לתוכנית אזורית משותפת. הוא מאפשר להרחיב את הבסיס הכלכלי ולעודד את הצמיחה של האזור על ידי שיפור התשתיות לשווקים הבינלאומיים. הפרוזדור יאפשר מוצא לים ובכך יפתח ויקדם את הסחר הבינלאומי. פיתוח האזורים הפריפריאליים של המדינה על ידי אספקת תשתיות משולבות ופיתוח המרחב. חיבור המדינות המפרץ עם ירדן, ישראל והפלסטינים באמצעות פרוזדור תשתיות שהוא כולל תחבורה, אנרגיה, מים, חשמל וכו', הוא יתרום לשיתוף פעולה כלכלי אזורי בין המדינות. החלופות לתכנון ופרוזדור תשתיות זה שנאמר, הוא בעצם 3 חלופות שרואים אותן כאן, כמו A, B ו-C. החלופות האלה, חלופה אחת מזרחית, מרכזית ומערבית, וכולם משתלפות בהמשך מצפון לדרום לתוואי שבעצם מגיע עד אזור אומן. החלופות האלה, כל אחת יש את היתרונות וחסרונות שלהם. נתחיל עם החלופה המרכזית, שהוא בעצם מתחיל מחיפה. מחיפה ישנו פרוזדור תשתיות שעובר בעצם דרך יהודה ושומרון, ה-West Bank, הוא למעשה יוצר פרוזדור בתוך השטח של הפלסטינים, לטובת הפלסטינים, ובהמשך אנחנו רואים למעשה שהוא מגיע לירדן, זה החלופה A. החלופה הנוספת שישנה מזרחית, היא בעצם מתחברת ישירות לנמל חיפה, והיא נמצאת בחלק המזרחי ביותר של ירדן. החלופה A שנמצאת במרכז, למעשה יש לה תועלות יותר גדולות, לתת שירותים וכולי, בחלק הדרומי של החלופה, שם בעצם הפריפריה של אזור של ירדן, שם הוא יאפשר לאזורים הפריפריאליים האלה לקבל שירותים ותשתיות ויגרום אותם לפיתוח. כאן אנחנו רואים את הפרוזדור המרכזי שהוא מגיע מישראל, הוא מתחבר לאומן, הפרוזדור המזרחי, כל אורך סעודיה ומגיע עד גם אומן, והפרוזדור המערבי שהוא בעצם הוא עובר לאורך החוף של הים האדום, הוא מתחבר לכיוון ריאד ומשם לכיוון אומן. זה על החלופות בשנית, אנחנו נציג אותם עכשיו. דבר נוסף ישנו פה, זה למעשה נושא הנפט, קו הנפט. יש אופציה מסוימת שהיא מלווה כמובן בבעיות אסטרטגיות, סביבתיות פה באזור הזה, שהוא בעצם הובלת הנפט לכיוון ישראל, לים התיכון. למעשה ישנו קו צינור קיים היום בין ריאד לחוף של הים האדום, להמשיך אותו צפונה ולחבר אותו לקו צינור אילת אשקלון. בעצם זה יאפשר לסעודים, ושבעצם הם מה שמשווקים את מירב הנפט לכיוון אירופה ולכיוון ארצות הברית, לשווק את הנפט. כמו שאמרתי, זו בעיה אסטרטגית, לכן זה רק אופציה וצריך לבחון אותה.
Shalom, and welcome to the economic panel of the Abraham Accords towards a new Middle East conference. The Abraham Accords themselves envision that both Israel and the UAE will reaffirm their shared belief that the establishment of peace and full normalization between them have a transformative effect on the Middle East. By spurring economic growth, encouraging technological innovation, and forging closer people connections, we can have an impact not only on the UAE, Israel, and Bahrain, but on the wider Middle East as well, including potentially on Judea and Samaria. In fact, given that Israel and the UAE are leaders in fields such as renewable energy, water tech, smart cities, this impact of this new partnership, of this new friendship, can go beyond the region and impact the entire world for good and our planet as well. Now, since the signing of the Abraham Accords, we've seen a tremendous outpouring both of goodwill and of business interest on both sides. In the organization which I helped found, the UAE Israel Business Council, we've seen thousands of business people on both sides expressing interest in developing relationships, in looking for opportunities, and getting to know one another. I'm joined today by an amazing panel of experts, both on the economic and financial opportunities and potential of the Abraham Accords and on the wider geostrategic and geopolitical implications. I'm joined today by Ahmed Zakaria, Vice Chairman of the Zakaria Family Group, a diversified family business with activities in many arenas. I'm joined by David Wumser, a Senior Fellow at the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., and at the Kohelet Policy Forum, the founder and CEO of the Delphi Global Analysis Group, and a former advisor on the Middle East to U.S. Vice President Dick Cheney and Undersecretary of State John Bolton. I'm joined by Riyad Zayadat, a business leader in Jordan, focusing primarily on the fields of tourism, who formerly served as the head of the Research and Study Department of the Jordanian Senate. And lastly, I'm joined by John Medved, CEO of Our Crowd, a leading equity crowdsourcing platform in Israel, and probably the first Israeli investor to appear on a public stage in the UAE when he appeared to speak about his unique model and the potential for cooperation already in December 2019 in Abu Dhabi. So I'm very excited, and let's get right to it. Ahmed, let's start with you. As an expert in the economic and financial sectors in the UAE, how do you think those sectors and the business community in large can help build bridges between Israel and the UAE? And what do you think are the areas of highest potential for cooperation between the two countries?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me here, Asher, on this program. I would like to first state that we're driven by economic imperatives, cultural and social imperatives as well. We have a young population that have huge aspiration and are hungry for life, are hungry for change, and hungry for moving forward. We're connected in a global economy with global players, and by no doubt, Israel is a global player in the main arena. And I believe that there are several areas of cooperation that both the UAE and Israel can work together in terms of technology being one of the most important. You've got logistics, you've got aviation, you've got green energy, you've got agri-tech, which is something very important to us here in this part of the world. Knowledge-based businesses, intelligence, tourism, technology, the list goes on and on. And I think that with the delivery of these powerful ideas and leadership that we have here in the UAE, we have tremendous infrastructure. And I think what we're looking for now is that soft infrastructure that I think Israel does have and that we can also adapt here in the UAE as well, such as knowledge, R&D, and innovation.
Thank you, Ahmed. And Raed, if we are looking at the tremendous potential which Ahmed described just now, how do you think these flourishing relations between, or the relations that appear that they will soon be flourishing between Israel and the UAE, how do you think they can affect the Israeli-Jordanian relationship as well?
If I get Mr. Ahmed, I think we already have business relations between us. We have, and I think the next stage for business, it's not going to be only country. It's universal. It has to be more than one country. Everybody has to deal with each other. We have tight relations. We have similar geography between Israel and Jordan. That helps. And I think what helps us a lot, that we need to involve the middle class in each country.
And who do you think will be the leaders in terms of which sectors in Jordanian society do you think could lead the potential strengthening of these relations between Israel and Jordan?
First of all, the people. Then after the decision making.
Thank you. Now,
did I get you right?
Yes, I agree. The people need to be the leaders. In this case, in the case of Jordan, I agree that unfortunately, as we've seen, the peace between the leadership has been a cold peace to date. And I also agree that the way to strengthen that peace is by building the people-to-people relationships, and in this case, working from the ground up. David, yes. I wanted to ask you, as an expert on the geostrategic implications, how do you think that this new economic relationship between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, how will that affect the region and beyond the region, especially given the strategic location of both Israel and the UAE?
Well, I think, we don't really have time to do a long history lesson, but one thing I would like to note is that throughout history, geostrategic realities often are the precondition for economic and trade patterns. So what we have is over the long term, trade patterns are almost dictated by geostrategic realities. I think what we're seeing now with the UAE-Israel peace agreement, and Bahrain as well, is that there are deeper geostrategic factors at work here that will eventually create very strong economic realities. This is not to say that there aren't a great amount of immediate opportunities and synergies between the UAE economy and the Israeli economy. And these things should be immediately exploited. But in the long term, what we see is a large block of nations geostrategically coming together. Japan, India, UAE, Israel, Greece. These are driven by geostrategic factors right now, and there's inescapably Iran, but less mentioned, but I think equally important, the danger of Turkey, drive these countries together. And the fact that the United States, which has defined the international architecture of trade and security for the last 60, 70, 80 years, is to some extent withdrawing. It's withdrawing in part to take care of its own problems, and it will still be an immense power, and it will still dictate the global realities. But at the end of the day, what you're seeing is America's allies beginning to emerge as a more independent and robust force in and of themselves, working together. So what I see is ultimately the UAE-Israel relationship having a strong economic dimension, but grounded in the larger geostrategic condition, and that will drive them ultimately to include India into this and Japan into this. So if you look at the synergies of those four economies, I think you see a tremendous amount of opportunity. But I would definitely look at those four as a block and as an economic opportunity taken together.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that analysis and that overview. Ahmed, returning to the Israeli-Emirati relationship, what do you think are potential pitfalls, and what are things that Israeli business people and perhaps Emirati business people as well should have in mind and take care to avoid or to adapt given the unique business culture of both countries?
I mean, well, first of all, let me just say one thing. You know, we're on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution, and I think both countries can come together, jobs, acquiring future skills, and so much more talent from. In terms of pitfalls, only one thing I could say is we're fast-paced here. Our leaders have given us amazing tools. They're phenomenal leaders who have given us amazing tools and drive us to always be the best. So we are fast-paced. We are fast-paced. We as a people are fast-paced as well. We're always thinking outside the box, and we always want to move forward and build the best to the best of our ability, and create synergies and opportunities for everybody. That's what we really want to do.
Now, and if I could ask also a follow-up question following David's insights, how do you think, or do you think, that the economic and business sector can contribute to advancing peace and normalization with additional Gulf states as well?
Well, the opportunity is extremely fruitful. Business is a bridge for peace. Business is a bridge to other nations. And I believe through the example that we are leading here in the Gulf region, in terms of what we've done, the bold steps that we have taken, others will look at us and say, you know what, let's move forward. Let's not reminisce about the past and move forward and open these doors and look at these strategic initiatives and these strategic goals that we have to take that can actually benefit people and both people of Israel and the Gulf countries altogether. So the potential is huge. And we're blessed here to have incredible leadership that really have given us this air of tolerance, air of acceptance, and to move forward. We are very driven, very fast-paced, and very driven.
With us is John Medved, CEO of Our Crowd, a leading equity crowdsourcing platform, and really one of the leaders in terms of developing relationships between the UAE and Israel. As I mentioned, John was probably the first Israeli investor to appear on a public stage in the UAE, and Our Crowd has already signed an MOU with Al Nabuda's group's Phoenix Capital to invest $100 million in the tech ecosystems of both countries. So John, how do you see the future of the bi-directional, bilateral relationship between the UAE and Israel business and tech sectors, and what kind of impact is this going to have on both the Israeli tech ecosystem and the Emirati tech ecosystem?
I want to second what Ahmed said about the speed in which the UAE is moving. We are moving at warp speed in terms of making this new agreement take shape in the economic realm. The genuine enthusiasm on the part of Emirati entrepreneurs, investors, it is all being supported by their amazing government and institutions that are set up to make this kind of investment and cooperation work. And whether it's in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, there will be others, inshallah, joining us. What has been most striking to us has been simply the almost innocent goodwill. I've been on so many Zooms now where people are giggling and smiling ear to ear. Not because this is silly, because of its the sort of unbridled joy of doing great business, which you know is going to be good for your country and for the partner's country, but also for the region and the world. The sense that we're making history, that it's so long overdue and so about time. And the fact that our two countries are coming together in this way is going to have a huge impact on our countries, on the region, on the world, and in particular in the economic sphere. And what I think people have to keep in mind is that the Emiratis in particular are very entrepreneurial. They have a really interesting startup ecosystem. We're already looking at investing in Emirati startups. Remember, they're a country who has already, sent an astronaut to the space station. They've launched their Mars probe. Okay, they are, people who we can cooperate with in the startup nation at eye-to-eye level. This is not about one side investing and the other side developing. This is about a bilateral investment opportunity for Israelis to put money in the Gulf and for investors in the Gulf to put money in Israel, but more importantly, to work strongly together on joint ventures where we're able to cooperate with people who are expert in logistics, in smart cities, in transportation, in desert agriculture, in ed tech, healthcare, and the range of opportunities is huge. So I'm quite bullish on this, and often start my day pinching myself and asking, is this really real? And you betcha, it's amazingly real.
Thank you, John. Thank you. And I want to follow up with that, with this question that I asked Ahmed as well. What do you see as potential pitfalls or potential areas where specifically Israeli investors or business people need to be careful as they're developing their relationships with their Emirati partners?
Building things that our children and grandchildren and their children will be the beneficiaries of. And you have to, I think, feel a huge weight of history and responsibility when you go into these relationships to make sure that you're behaving with the utmost ethics, with the utmost sensitivity, to realize that this is breaking new ground, that we're creating this culture of cooperation. So far, so good. But I worry that some people might take a short-sighted sort of make a quick buck kind of attitude, and that's not what's called for here.
Since we are close to each other, so the tourists who come from all over the world, we should have more like it's more wider programs for those tourists. We can market your country and you can market our country. And we already have the Petra as a something in common. Many people from your side, they come to Petra. We can increase this to be to more than one country. And we have here in Jordan, we have like the religion tourism, since we have the baptism in Jordan. And we need to work on many things. Like we already have many tourism areas, and we need to market this more and more.
Thank you.
And we already, since we are close to each other, the tourists can move easily between us and Israel.
Thank you. And I'm sure we're all very much hoping to see that happen very soon. David, if we look even closer to Israel, what do you think are the implications of this new economic relationship for the reality and the experience in Judea and Samaria and in the Palestinian Authority as well? Do you think that these new connections between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain will also have an impact right here in the Holy Land?
Look back over the last decades, again, the geostrategic matters here. I think the UAE-Israel relationship provides a bridge to the Palestinians, even though geographically that doesn't quite make sense, but it provides a bridge to the Palestinians. I think if you look back over 40, 50 years, the Palestinian economy and the Israeli economy were deeply related until the first Intifada, and with the violence and the decisions that were made to launch some of the violence by the Palestinian leadership, especially in the second Intifada, you saw the great separation of the Israeli and Palestinian worlds. And I think this also put a block on Israeli-Jordanian interactions as well, which caused a major economic problem. I think the re-entry of the UAE and the ability to leverage the relationship with the UAE to help encourage the rise of a different Palestinian leadership, a new generation of Palestinian leadership that is interested in ultimately the welfare of the Palestinian community, I think provides an excellent opportunity to push out, to provide a barrier to countries like Turkey and Iran, which were using the stasis, the situation in the Palestinian area to create a complete shutdown of economic activity that's productive in the long run. Israel is becoming one of the, Ahmed said that there's a fourth industrial age. He's absolutely right. And in that industrial age, the UAE and Israel are becoming very important global economic centers. And I think this is the opportunity for the Palestinians, and to some extent the Jordanians with them, to position themselves differently, but it would require a generational change in the leadership among the Palestinians. And I think that is where really the role of the UAE, in addition to the money and the investment and the speed and intelligence of investment, comes in. But it also helps politically and geostrategically.
John, also over to you, looking at we've also had business relations and investments in a number of the countries in the region. How do you see this new relationship, this new open relationship between Israel and the UAE having an impact on the region? And you can take that in any direction that you'd like.
So I think that the normalization with UAE and Bahrain is obviously only the start of a renewed process. I don't know if there will be 4 countries more, or 6 countries, or 8, or even 10, God willing, that will join, but there will be more countries joining. And we're finding already enormously important changes in our contacts with some of the other obvious players in the region, where they're the early movers, let's say, are already moving. Obviously we're all waiting for the formal normalization process to take its appropriate steps, but business people are reading the tea leaves and feeling the way the wind's moving, and are starting to preempt. And that's a very big thing. Remember that we're talking about a huge market opportunity, right? In other words, the GCC itself is a remarkable market for activity. But when you take the larger Arab and Islamic world that now can be addressed through partnerships with the Gulf countries, this is extraordinary. Because remember, there are almost 2 billion people of Islam in the world. And the fact that we are now able to work together, and not just to sell stuff, but to fix things, to make the world better, to solve problems of water and health and energy and climate change and desertification. We have so much to offer each other. It is really one of these things where I believe it or not, I feel that the importance of this agreements has been underhyped. I don't think people understand how fundamentally this has changed the rules of the game for the betterment of all of our people, but really for the entire world.
While the economic potential, I think, is clear, both for Israeli and Emirati relations, but for relations between Israel and many other countries, as John said, the challenge has been in some countries, not in the Emirates, where we've seen, like as John and Ahmed mentioned, a tremendous outpouring of goodwill spearheaded by the Emirati leadership. But in other countries, one of the main challenges has been public opinion. And Ryan, I wanted to ask you, how do you think that we can shift public opinion in Jordan so that it's supportive and open to all of the economic possibilities that exist in enhanced relations between Israel and Jordan?
I agree with Ahmed that business is a bridge for peace between the people. The business will help us already to shift those opinions to the right track. They need to feel the business, feel the benefit of it. That helps a lot. That's the way we can shift those opinions. And we need to like more social relations between both people to see the right side, the good side for each other. And the business will help a lot.
Thank you. David, what role do you think the American administration can play in encouraging specifically the business and economic ties between Israel and the UAE, though I don't know how much encouragement they need as they are advancing at warp speed, and between Israel and the broader region?
Well, yes, I think that you mentioned the fact that they're moving at warp speed. So I really don't know if the United States can give much more of a push to the UAE-Israel part of it. But one thing I've noticed dealing with Japanese companies, Indian companies, and so forth, is that Israel is really a world they don't understand. And Israel, like the UAE, operates at a speed of decision and investment that the Japanese and to some extent the Indians are not as much used to, as well as on the other side, the Greeks and so forth. So I think one role the United States can play is to bring some of these more distant elements of this emerging coalition, strategically, but I think also economically, to essentially put the kosher stamp, so to speak, on the UAE-Israel relationship and investment in the joint structures that will emerge from that and the economy. Israel has immense access to Silicon Valley. Now it has immense access to the UAE. The UAE is a fast, smart, incisive investor. The Far East can miss out if they don't join. And I think the primary role of the United States right now is to turn to the Far East, specifically Japan, Korea, and India, and basically say, listen, this is a very important economic bloc emerging, and it would be very important for your investors in your country to feel the encouragement from the United States, the sanctioning from the United States to do business in that framework. I think that would help.
Can I make a comment here? It's so interesting. Just this morning, I was on a call with a group of Japanese businessmen about a webinar sponsored by JETRO, which is the state trade investment board in Japan. And you know what they're interested in talking to Israel about? The importance of the new UAE, Bahrain agreements and its implications for Israel-Japanese trade. Remember, Israel's trade with Asia for the last decade has been booming. The Abe period in Japan has grown our trade by hundreds of percent. And Japanese companies are very active now, in particular in the Israeli market, opening up partnerships and whatnot. And they're totally aware of what's going on now in the rapprochement with Israel and its neighbors in the Gulf. And this is going to have a huge impact broader. And I think David is spot on in terms of his analysis here.
And Jim, let me follow up with that. And this is also probably a question which many of the people viewing this panel from the economic and financial sectors are asking themselves and are interested in. So Ahmed mentioned a number of fields. He mentioned agri-tech, he mentioned intelligence, he mentioned green tech, which you also talked about sustainability and the shared challenges of desertification and climate change. What other areas do you believe have potentially very, very high promise, whether it's fintech perhaps, or health, or any other areas that you think, whether in Israel or the UAE, are going to be particularly productive, especially in the initial stages of developing this relationship?
Remember that the UAE in particular and Bahrain are financial powerhouses. And therefore, the area of fintech, financial technology is, in my mind, first and foremost in terms of things that can be accomplished together. And there's great interest on the part of the UAE authorities of bringing technology into this area in their country. And in fact, they've already got a track record of recruiting overseas coders and programmers and system architects to come and build things in their region. And I predict that you will see Israeli tech companies who have pretty much hit the ceiling in terms of employment. One of the real challenges here in Israel is even while we have 900,000 unemployed, our tech economy is missing 20,000 bodies. Okay, we need more skilled people. Now, long term, we have to do this by bringing in more Palestinians and Arab Israelis into the tech sector, and Haredim, ultra-Orthodox, more women. But we also need to think about how we turn this region into a magnet for smart entrepreneurs and technologists from around the world. And if they want to work on the beaches of Tel Aviv or on the beaches of Dubai and Abu Dhabi, it's all good. And I think that together, our ability to recruit, bring people and to work on these things, in fintech in particular, is important. I also think that anything having to do with artificial intelligence, which of course is not really an area because it's infusing all areas, right? There's AI, which is driving ag tech, and AI, which is driving mobility, and AI, which is driving healthcare. And as you know, Israel is probably one of the top 3 countries in the world developing artificial intelligence technologies together with the US and China. And our friends in the Gulf are very aware of this. And I think you'll see a lot of AI infused deals, in particular in healthcare. We're already in discussions on that, but also in other disciplines that will utilize Israel's sort of core competence in the AI arena, but direct it to others.
David, as somebody who's also been consulting to companies and to countries on the region, are there areas that you see as of particular importance or particularly high potential?
yes, I would second everything that John said. This is not an instead of it. I would add to it that one should really look at the big industries, the huge scaled industries that you see operating in Japan and Korea, and where they're beginning to have problems is on the innovation side. They're not producing the innovation that they needed to produce. And I think the role of the UAE and Israel is to be the incubator for ideas in the framework of large industries, capital industries. It's a whole new role for Israel, rather than just the high-tech world living within a high-tech industry. I think I would encourage the UAE and Israel to think also about the role that innovation is going to have to play in these large structures of industrial production in Japan and Korea, and how they can integrate into those structures as the innovation incubator, innovation stimulator of these increasingly ossified and slower moving industries.
Well, I think it's clear that the Abraham Accords both have tremendous potential in terms of the UAE-Israel bilateral relationship, but as we've heard from our panelists, have really a transformative potential for both the Middle East and much further, looking out to Europe, looking out to Asia, to Japan, to Korea, and even beyond. And obviously, I think the impact of this Abraham Accords will only be clear to us in a few years, but I think it's clear that the Middle East will look different in a few years because of this, and that the people-to-people connections and the business and economic and financial sectors have an extremely important role to play in building this new Middle East. So I want to thank all of our panelists, to Ahmed, to John, to David, and to Riyadh. Thank you so much for your insights, and thank you very much to all of the viewers. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the panelists and speakers. Thank you to the audience around the world. Special thanks to Dr. Anat Roth for organizing the event. Shalom, salam from Jerusalem.